preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to our About Women lecture series. My name is Susan Engel, and I direct the Adult Division in the Center for Adult Life and Learning. Before I introduce tonight's program, I want to remind you of the remaining lecture that we have in this series this season on December 21st, when Felice Schwartz, who is the founder of the organization Catalyst, will discuss the conspiracy of silence, women's needs in the workplace. And now for tonight, and our guest, who will address a different kind of silence that pervades our private as well as public domains. Her topic this evening, Gender, War, and the Survival of the Planet, draws on her extensive research and critically acclaimed books. Most recently, A Chorus of Stones, The Private Life of War, which was a jury finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and will be on sale following the program at an autographing session right outside this hall. This amazing book offers a radical rethinking of the nature of war and gender and the interplay between private suffering and public tragedy. At once philosophical and lyrical, this book speaks to the predicament of modernity, and with a passionate eloquence, its writer calls upon us, her readers, to embrace a new and revolutionary framework for examining these issues. A well-known and respected feminist writer, poet, essayist, lecturer, teacher, and filmmaker, she is the author of 14 books, including the groundbreaking Women and Nature and Pornography and Silence, and is the recipient of many awards and honors. Women and Nature inspired the international movement known as ecofeminism. In addition, her play Voices won an Emmy Award, and she has also contributed to several films, most notably as narrator for the Academy Award-nominated film called Berkeley in the 60s. Currently, she is working on a collection of essays on ecology and feminism, and a book about illness and society called Knowledge of the Body. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome, Susan Griffin.
Well, I'm going to speak to you about, try to cover some of the ground that I explored when I wrote A Chorus of Stones, The Private Life of War, and really speak about knowledge tonight. I'd like to speak about knowledge tonight, and I think I would like these lights down. You can't see that, but there's lights here in my eyes, and they're disturbing. There's a kind of a bifurcation, a splitting of knowledge in this culture. They're not down yet. Now, it's these spots that are shining on the stage, and they're right in my eyes. Can you get those off? No, it's not the ones over my head, it's the ones, you want to? No. Well, they're a little, I just like them off. Let me show you. All right, that's great, that's better. Okay. You still don't really have, I really like them off. Can you do that? Good, thank you. Okay, that's much better. Okay. I want to just begin with a paragraph from the first chapter of the book. I am beginning to believe that we know everything, that all history, including the history of each family, is part of us, such that when we hear any secret revealed, a secret about a grandfather or an uncle, or a secret about the Battle of Dresden in 1945. Our lives are made suddenly clearer to us as the unnatural heaviness of unspoken truth is dispersed. For perhaps we are like stones, our own history and the history of the world embedded in us. We hold a sorrow deep within and cannot weep until that history is sung. So there's a kind of way that we know, I think, much that we're not supposed to know. It's what is called often denial. And even secrets which we don't know, we have some inkling of. We can sense the consequences. We can sense the effect of them in our lives. But there's a very effective way within this culture that we have of keeping certain knowledge away from us. And it creates a false feeling of safety, but it also creates a terrible feeling of loss and emptiness not to have that knowledge. When I began this book, I had a story of a family secret that I wanted to write about. It's in the book, and I'm not going to go into it tonight, but it involves a grandmother who was wiped out of our family history. And I wanted to find out something about this woman whom I was supposed to pretend growing up as a child didn't exist. And I had succeeded for most of my life in participating in the family pattern of denial and wiping her out of my mind, so that I was, to my knowledge, not curious about her. But at the age of 40, I suddenly woke up and I thought, I do have, like everybody else, two grandmothers, or I did have two grandmothers, and I wanted to know who she was. And at the same time, this was in the beginning of the 80s, and we were in the midst, as you all know, of a terrible arms race. And I was becoming aware of it in a way that I hadn't been before. I, like many people in America and in the then Soviet Union, was coexisting with these terrible weapons as if they weren't there. Weapons which at that point were threatening, and still are, as a matter of fact, threatening to destroy the biosphere. And as reports of nuclear winter came out and friends of mine began to inform themselves and organize around the issue, I became aware of what a danger we were all living with, as if it weren't happening. And I knew that I really had to write about this as the danger penetrated my mind. And yet I also wanted to write my family. And I began to realize finally that these two books, these two subject matters really belong together, that this way that we divide public and private life is a false division. It's a conceptual division, which is unreal. But the feeling, the illusion of reality, of that unreality, is so strong that in the beginning, to speak of something like the private life of war, which is the subtitle of this book, appears to be an oxymoron. War is a public event. What is the private life of war? If you look at what are the private and public realms, what do they represent symbolically? The whole system, the duality, falls along the same lines as other dualities within our culture. The one which I think it resembles most closely is that separation between the idea of the masculine and the idea of the feminine, or the social construct of the male gender and the female gender. And so that the private world is the world the world that exists in people's homes and emotions, sexuality, intimacy, childhood. This is the feminine realm. And the public realm belongs to the masculine, and is the realm of history, public events, and intellectual discourse and political discourse. The two realms function to contain secrets, and so that one can know something in the private life and yet not know it publicly. You cross that doorway, you cross the lintel of the door out into the public realm, and you suddenly don't know it any longer. Most of us here, I'm looking at this audience, and it's mostly an audience of contemporaries to me, and we were all alive and well before there was a feminist movement. And in that earlier period, rape, the sexual abuse of children, sexual harassment were not, and the battering of wives were not part of public discourse. They weren't spoken about. They sort of faded into the background. It was feminism that made them part of a public discussion. So that these events, which were looked at as belonging to a private world, disappeared in public life. In the same way, what occurs in public life disappears in the private realm, so that a sort of false world, an illusionary world of safety exists. So that you can find a man who, for instance, this is a true story, who was a concentration camp guard during the Holocaust, could come home and have a very loving relationship with his wife and behave, in a kind way to his wife, and then go back and be very brutal in his work, what he did at work existed as if on a different planet. In his mind, it didn't touch his private life, and his wife found out what happened at his workplace. She found out about what was going on at the concentration camps and decided no longer to be his wife in the marriage bed. And yet, after a period of time, she found herself being his wife erotically again. And it was, and I read this story in the London Times, and having read this story and thinking about it over the years, I began to realize how that would happen, because everything in marriage, everything in the traditional private life, tends to erase the public life. That's the force and energy of it, is to erase what goes on in the public world. I want to read you a passage, tell you a story about Enrico Fermi. This book, A Chorus of Stone, tells the story of the development of nuclear weapons, and I start the whole story in World War I, because in the period just before World War I, because what had to precede the development of nuclear weapons was the strategy of bombing civilians. The firebombing at Dresden during World War II killed 135,000 people, which is roughly the same number of people who died in Hiroshima before radiation poisoning took its toll. The difference between the firebombing at Dresden and Hiroshima, in addition to radiation, was that it took one airplane with one bomb rather than several airplanes with several bombs. So it was a more economical way to produce the same kind of firestorm. So that the decision to build nuclear weapons was very much part and parcel of the decision to bomb civilians. That's what that weapon was produced for. And oftentimes nuclear history is looked at simply as if it were some kind of technological accident that happened to humanity, sort of like, oh my God, we just stumbled over this weapon and we're not developed enough to use it. But in fact, we didn't stumble over the weapon, we made the decision to do what the weapon does before we found a technology to do it more efficiently. Well, a man who was vital to that, Enrico Fermi was a man who was vital to that process of developing the nuclear weapon, because he created the first chain reaction, and that's what nuclear fission is. And he was uniquely talented for that because he was a brilliant theoretical physicist, and he also was a very able engineer. And it took someone with that practical knowledge as well as theoretical knowledge to create this event. It was a major event in scientific history, but he produced it under the aegis of the Manhattan Project, which was the governmental project that created the first atomic bomb. And because he was under the aegis of the Manhattan Project, he was bound to complete secrecy. He was not even allowed to tell his wife or any members of his family what he was doing at work. And his wife, Laura Fermi, was not ignorant of scientific matters. In fact, after the war, she wrote a history of the development of the bomb and of the Manhattan Project, but she was not told what he was doing at work during this period. And the great ironic event was that in the very beginning stages, just after on the day that he created a chain reaction, there was a party held to celebrate this major achievement, and it was held at the Fermi home. But Laura Fermi, who was the hostess for the party, didn't know what was being celebrated. There is a party at the Fermi home. This party is held after Fermi has created the first chain reaction. But none of those present speak of this event, and the hostess, Laura Fermi, does not know the reason for the celebration. Later, she is to write a history of these events, which she saw but did not witness. What do the guests at this party do? Because the husbands know something the wives do not, is the atmosphere strained? Or is the party like so many others where the husbands congregate in another room and hold a separate conversation, speaking as usual about things the wives never know? Do they dance? Later, when Fermi is alone with his wife, do they undress together? Their bodies become suddenly so innocent, simple, unclothed. Being naked and undisguised as truth, do they lie down together? Does he open his mouth to her, put his tongue in her mouth, her vagina, his penis in her? Hearing her cries, does he also cry even from someplace unwilled in him, his flesh, the cells, washed as if by light or life with pleasure, and more the pure sense of being? And at the same time, his skin like a cloud diffusing into her skin, through her flesh, the room, the bedroom curtains, the horizon. At this moment, where is his secret? Does he let it go? Believe it never happened? Bury it deeper inside himself in a wordless place, in a place described only by formula and the vocabulary of science, a vocabulary he keeps apart from all the words he uses at home: breast, leaf, river, doorbell, cup, child, love, Fermi. Does he ever tell his secret to himself in this plain language? So that the separation of masculine and feminine not only creates separate worlds for men and women, which of course is just a conceptual separation, because men exist in the private life, and women, even in a very traditional life, are certainly deeply affected by decisions that are made in public life, and the two worlds are not at all separate, but affect each other very deeply. But that conceptual separation allows not only for secrets to be contained in one world or the other, but also it allows for a separation within the self, so that a man like Fermi, or on a different moral order, I believe, a man who's a concentration camp guard, can return home and in some way not really know what he's done, not know what he's doing, because the sort of tender, emotional, connected, relational part is kept in the private life, and in that life, the public life is not discussed, it's not admitted. And so there's a kind of lack of response to one's own life, not to speak of responsibility. This split that exists between the masculine and feminine world, between public and private life, also reflects a philosophical duality, which is very old in what some people call European, Eurocentric culture. We used to call it Western civilization. The deconstructionist calls it logocentric, and it's called Eurocentric. It's the European tradition which developed from the Greeks to the Romans, and theologically very influenced by Christianity. And that separation in Christian theology, between the private and the public, very much mirrors the separation in Christian theology between matter and spirit. So that the feminine realm is the material and earthly realm, and it's also the realm of domesticity and private life. And the masculine realm is the spiritual realm, closer to God, more rational, I suppose better able to do mathematical calculations, intellectually superior, and also the realm of, in a way, opposed to matter, of spirit uncorrupted from matter. Because in this system, the earth belongs to Satan, and temptation and sensuality is tinged with the idea of sin. And so that the closer you get to God, the freer you are of sensual knowledge and earthly knowledge. Many people think of the invention of modern science as a very radical departure from this theology. But in fact, it was in some ways a departure. The whole idea of basing knowledge on experiment rather than deduction was a departure. But the theological concepts, the sort of way of organizing the world, the most basic philosophical assumptions, were carried forward from Christian theology into science. For instance, the very question, what is the nature of light, is a Christian question. And the first scientists were monks, and they asked this question very much in a theological context. It was that question which led to the Michelson-Morley experiments, and those are the experiments which inspired or which gave kind of a sense to Einstein's speculations and led to the theory of relativity. The Michelson-Morley experiments were experiments with light. The separation that Christian theology made between matter and spirit got translated in modern science into the idea of matter and energy. The idea of spirit earlier, way earlier, in Greek thought and also in the Judaic tradition in Hebrew, was originally energy. The word spirit is breath in Greek. Spirit has a Greek etymology, and it means breath originally. And it's the same in Hebrew. Ruah is breath. And so it's the spirit is that which gives energy to matter. The prejudice that modern science inherited was the idea that these two realms, matter and spirit, or matter and energy, what science called it now was energy, were separate from each other. That they were opposite somehow in some fundamental fashion. That they had they were almost hostile to one another in the same way that heaven and earth in Christian theology are hostile to one another. Well, what Einstein discovered, and other high-energy physicists, was that in fact matter and energy are not separate, but they exist on a continuum. When the nucleus of the atom was opened up, what was seen there was patterns of energy. So this kind of ambiguity that exists in higher energy physics. They'll say, well, have we seen a particle or have we seen a wave? And it turns out that a particle is a wave and a wave is a particle. In other words, energy is matter and matter is energy. Energy has mass, it has weight. It is of the earth, and matter has energy, it has spirit. So what this should have done for us within this civilization was to deeply alter our philosophical and epistemological and ethical approach to ourselves in the universe. It should have made us kind of reevaluate our whole way of understanding who we are and what the world is. But what we did instead, rather than to embrace a more harmonious view of the earth and of existence as something which is not made up of opposed qualities but of one continuous process, what we did, instead of ending a kind of, I think, ideology of alienation, what we did was that we found a way technologically to split the atom. In other words, to separate matter and energy, and that's what E equals mc square is when it becomes an atomic explosion. It is not a vision of the harmony of the universe, but it's a splitting apart of the very matrix of the universe. Well, in this book, A Chorus of Stones, one of the things that I did, and I just stumbled across this as a way of writing, I identify with everyone in the book. That is, I don't take their part morally, because I identify with many people who I found unspeakable and abhorrent ethically, and the worst being Heinrich Himmler, who's part of nuclear history. But I wanted to enter into the consciousness of all the people in this story, which is our story. It's our story as a culture, so that I could understand how this happened. How did we get to this place? How did we arrive to a moment in history when we were spending billions of dollars and using the best minds of our time to create weapons that threatened the very survival of the planet? Why is it that we came to such a moment? And it seemed to me that one of the only ways to understand that would be to try to go inside the consciousness, as writers of fiction do all the time. So I imagined myself inside the consciousness of many people. And also, one of the things I did was I imagined myself inside the consciousness of a neutron, because the neutron is that little subatomic particle that moves out of the atom when the atom is bombarded, and it bombards another atom and releases other neutrons, which in turn bombard other nuclei of other atoms, and that's what a chain reaction is, and that's what creates an atomic explosion. There is a matrix of meaning in the material world. Is it this matrix that culture reflects? Just as our lives are defined by the intricate connections we are born to and have made, any given particle, a neutron for instance, derives its significance from its environment, the atom. This environment is not fixed, but is instead a chemical process, a constantly changing field of matter and energy. Yet even these constant changes possess some order, some still ineffable reason. It is a reason derived from connection, and it is this reason which is destroyed by a chain reaction. Neutrons bombard atoms, and these atoms release other neutrons, which in turn bombard other atoms. The matrix in which the neutron lived is torn apart, and the world of connection becomes a diaspora. The neutron does not travel very far when it is driven from the atom. The distance is not perceivable to our eyes or even imaginable. When we try to understand the neutron, we draw pictures of it which are enlarged many thousands of times, but these pictures fail us too, for the neutron exists someplace in its smallness, someplace as precise and exact as our own bedrooms, our kitchens, a place that is a world with its own laws, its own being. To the neutron, the space through which it travels is vast, like a void, a great immeasurable emptiness. Does the neutron have consciousness? Where does our own consciousness live? In the cells? In the animal alone? I can't answer this. Only I know that the neutron does belong to a world of meaning, a meaning that is in us too. in our bodies and in all that surrounds us. As the neutron leaves the atom, does it feel senseless and without purpose? Does it feel the anguish of separation? Does it despair? I know such a loneliness as I imagine the neutron possesses in its journey through the void. Sometimes it feels as if part of my flesh. As a child, I saw everyone I loved leave me in one day. My parents separated. I was sent to my grandmother and my sister to my great aunt. My memory is of an endless chill descending, sweeping all my family away, even as if by violence, though no one had really died, and for a few months we were all still just a few miles apart. But time and distance cannot be measured except as we know them. Distance is relative to feeling. One of the things that I did in the book was to trace this story of my grandmother and her exile from my family, and to see the sorrow that that exile caused into many generations and affecting me finally also. And to also see then how that exile of my grandmother from our family and many other sorrows in the family occurred in a way that was inextricably woven with nuclear history, with military history and the history of empire and the history of these divisions, particularly the division between the private and public realm and the masculine and feminine gender. One of the other purposes of this split between masculine and feminine psychologically in this culture is to create a separated world in which the knowledge of death is held. It's something that I wrote about at length in another book, Pornography and Silence. The feminine realm, of course, is not monolithic. There are many different images within this culture, and even constructed images that we have of the feminine. And two major ones, again, it's a duality between the Madonna and the whore. And the Madonna is the nurturing. The mother is the nurturing, sustaining figure. But the whore holds the idea of death. In Christian theology, around in the 13th century, Genesis was interpreted such that Eve was supposed to have brought death into the world through sin. It's a way in this culture that we have of denying mortality. If we are not of the earth and subject to biological process and biological change, if we believe that we aren't, somebody has to hold death, because death is obviously real. So symbolically, a certain kind of woman holds death, and it's the temptress, the seductress, Salome, Eve, the whore. In nuclear history, in all military history, soldiers are known to go to prostitutes and to rape women. Brothels are set up very often around military encampments. You've probably heard of the destruction that happened in the lives of so many women and in the culture in Vietnam, Korea, when systems of brothels were set up around American military camps. In Vietnam, there was a phrase called double veteran. If a man both raped a woman or slept with her and murdered her, he became a double veteran. It was so common that there was this slang for that event. The men who dropped the bomb over Hiroshima were known as Hellraisers. They were a battalion of men who were trained especially for this purpose, and they were told that they had a secret mission, and they knew that it was dangerous, and they were told it was dangerous. And I think the constant fear of death made them more wild than most soldiers when they went on leave, and so they were known to rape and get into fights and see prostitutes frequently. And I wanted to go inside this experience and see what I could find there. So this is a portion of the book I wrote about that. A man, perhaps he is a soldier, and nearly ready to go into battle, goes to see a prostitute. He goes first to a bar, or to 2 or 3 or many bars, and drinks among men. Then when he is tight enough, but still able to walk, still able to feel himself in his sex, he searches in the last bar or the neighborhood surrounding it. What is he looking for? A color of hair, the shape of a face, a way of moving, large breasts or a lean body, light or dark skin, none of this matters. Some bit of her, her laugh, the way she looks, will reach him and eat into his imagination until he is drawn. Not knowing this woman, he is drawn inevitably towards that which he remembers or that which he has always dreamed of and learned in some way to associate with a turn of a head, the purely physical inflection of a voice. He follows as a force that seems to be hers takes him closer and closer. Who is she? He learns very little. Whatever she tells him, she invents. In the darkened rooms where they meet, he is not able to tell that she has taken drugs enough to take the edge away from her awareness or more to make her nearly insensible. He will not have to remember her name. She only pretends to learn his name. He may ask to be beaten or to beat her. He may want to caress her, to pull her to him roughly and quickly. Perhaps he asks her to put his sex in her mouth. He may want to swear at her or give her orders. As the sex comes into him, a certain sharpness enters his mind, like windows, doors opening. There is a place inside him, between his chest and thighs, in and through, in his belly, his penis, his testicles, that starts to unwind as he grows larger, as if space itself became larger, even infinite. And inside him, like someone dying, images enter his mind unbidden. He is more drunken than drunk. Perhaps he cries out or shouts. He thinks of his own death. He puts his sex large with wanting inside her, and despite himself, his body sighs, sinking into pleasure and then into more desire as he moves in her, wanting, his skin intense with feeling. He senses death, something in him almost breaking. He may shout again, and then it is warm, it breaks, it is sweet, it is gone. He rolls away from her, surviving. He has vanquished this small death, and now he hardly notices her. His mind is racing back to where he came from, feeling cold, saying nothing of what he has seen, what he has felt. He stands and puts on his clothes. He will give her money now and quickly make his way back to the street where he can be among other men again. The French have a term for orgasm. They call it petit mort, which translated means little death. And there's a way in which immersing oneself in sensual experience, particularly sexuality, becomes dangerous in a culture that denies death. Because physical experience, sensual experience, all of it contains death. That's what it is to live. There's loss in every moment. You are always aging. The sun comes up and goes down. You have a feeling, and it leaves. You have a feeling in your body, and it changes. And that's the nature of life, this kind of change, and one of the most extreme changes we know of is death. So that sensuality then needs to be cordoned off because it contains this knowledge of mortality. It has to be cordoned off and put with a group of women who then are labeled whores or labeled inadmissible in some way into the public arena, into public knowledge. What we pay for this separation from mortality is very great, and in fact I came to believe in writing this book that one of the things we pay for it is a movement, a very irrational movement towards the creation of a terrible death, a death not only individual death, which is natural, but the death of the planet and of the death of human beings and of the ability of the planet to sustain life at all. A kind of terribly ironic part of nuclear history is that this astonishing knowledge of the nature of the material of the universe, which high-energy physics came to in this century, has also led to the suppression of knowledge. It's led to an incredible censorship, which becomes a problem in a democracy. A great deal of the production of nuclear weapons and now of nuclear power has to be kept secret from people. And I want to tell you one of these stories. There was a man who I interviewed, and I'm going to read bits of this from the book, who was an atomic vet. You may or may not have heard about what happened to these men. They were Marines and men in the armed services, and they were sent in to the experimental explosions of atomic bombs in the 50s. And many of them were placed within a mile or 3 miles of ground zero being the place where the bomb actually drops. And the stated purpose of these experiments was to see how men would react under the emotional pressure of an atomic explosion. But the unstated purpose, but what definitely was part of the purpose, was to see what radiation would do to their bodies. So they were a kind of scientific guinea pig. That the military was then deciding whether they would use nuclear weapons tactically. The euphemisms used are that we call bombing civilians strategical bombing, and bombing on a battlefield is called tactical bombing. So these men were exposed to radiation. They dug trenches, so they weren't exposed to the burns of an atomic explosion, but they were exposed to radiation, and a great many of them are ill. Many have died, and many still have various kinds of cancers. This man that I interviewed had leukemia by the time that I spoke to him. He was a sergeant, and very, very proud of his life in the military. One of the things that happened was that after he got exposed, he was quite ill almost immediately, and he was taken to the hospital and then returned to military service in just a matter of days. And he put on a 200-pound pack and walked, with his what do you call it? Squadron, I don't know the military term, and he walked, for several miles until he fainted in exhaustion. But he wanted to prove that he was, capable of this, and his idea of masculinity meant that he had to push forward in this way, trying to overcome the feelings in his body. But of course, that's the training he had as a soldier, and I'll speak more of that in a moment. But what happened to him was that he witnessed two things when he was out there in the experiment. One was that there were two men under his command who he never saw after that explosion, and it was only years later that he learned that they had died. That was suppressed from the press and the public altogether, and he himself was lied to about it. But he was a very deeply responsible man, and so he couldn't stop being concerned about them, and he couldn't stop asking about them. He also, when he was returned to the base, he was taken by a truck back to the base, and the truck was driving through this dust that was raised by the atomic explosion and lost its way, and hence he saw an experiment which he was not meant to see. And he was not the only soldier. There was another man, a lieutenant, who saw the same thing. There were men who were above ground. They weren't in trenches, and they were behind barbed wire, and they weren't in military uniform, and they had those kind of burns that people in Hiroshima suffered during the dropping of the atomic bomb, and their skin was hanging off their arms. And he was, of course, horrified to see this and couldn't forget it, and kept asking his commanders what was this about. And when he was in the hospital, he kept talking to nurses and asking them what it was. And what they did in response to these questions of his was that they sent him to a military hospital in Balboa, California, and doped him up with all kinds of drugs and sent him to psychologists who alternatively tried to hypnotize him out of what he saw, drug him out of what he saw, and threaten him. Told them that he would be court-martialed and or killed if he continued to speak about it. But what happened was that finally he left the military, and he did finally give up trying to speak about it. But what happened was that the physical symptoms in his own illness kept returning. And the way that it finally returned was intolerable to him, and he began once more to speak about and ask those questions and to speak about what he saw. What gave him the most pain, besides his guilt over the two missing men and the unnamed men he saw in the compound, was fear for the health of his children. Over the years since that time, his wife had had 5 miscarriages. Twice, he told me, he thought of taking his own life. Once was when his son was ill. The symptoms were so much like his own: hair loss, skin turning yellow, and his blood was abnormal. But his son recovered. The second time was when his grandchild began to pass blood in his stool and urine, and Israel said to himself, "That's me again." He had bled this way intermittently since the test. The effects of the experiment also continued in his mind. In one dream, he tried to run from the blast while his superior officer shouted, "You're supposed to stay here. You're a leader of men." That was not the way it happened. "I did stay," he told me, but the dream still troubled him. Many times he dreamed that the wind returned, the same wind that came with the blast and tore the helmet and gloves right off his body. In these dreams, the wind tried to pull him up and out of the earth. In still other returning dreams, he tried to find his missing men. And of course, he would see the men in the compound again, buried, monstrous, covering their faces with their hands. "Do you know what it is," he asked me, "for a grown man to break down and cry?" I could imagine what it was for him. Not only the pain of all he had endured becoming in one moment no longer endurable, but the shattering at the same moment of a sheltering, encircling notion of who he was: a strong man, a protector, responsible to care for those more tender than he, those given to tears, but not the one who breaks down, never breaking down himself. Many nights he would wake screaming and be unable to sleep again. At 2 or 3 in the morning, he would come into the living room alone and turn on the television. Once at 4 in the afternoon, he found himself reliving the atomic experiment. He was seeing melted tanks, the mushroom, the medical trucks, dirt flying, the smoke, the whole thing, he told me. His sons had to hold him down on the bed until it was over. Well, when he began to speak out, he found the same difficulty once again. The doctors at the Veterans Hospital wouldn't give him his radiation count. He consulted a lawyer, came with the lawyer back to the same hospital to speak to the same doctor who had been treating him, and this doctor denied that he had ever seen him before. He found another doctor who was outside the system, but who agreed to help him in his case and kept petitioning the military for what his radiation count was. And finally, he went to one of his regular visits to see this doctor, and the doctor had left no forwarding address. And Israel asked himself if perhaps that doctor hadn't been contacted by the Veterans Administration. And then there was the newspaper article. At the time of the test, Israel was not allowed to tell his young wife where he was or why, but she read the newspapers. And she saw a picture of him in a local paper with a caption that connected him to these tests. Years later, when Israel began to make inquiries about his own case and his missing men and the men in the compound, the Veterans Administration claimed they had no record of his participation in these tests, and that as far as they were concerned officially, he had not been there. It was then that his wife remembered the newspaper. He wrote a friend in the area where it had been published who went for him into the newspaper storage room, what is called the morgue, where they keep back issues. Israel's wife was right. The friend sent 3 copies. Immediately, Israel sent one to the Veterans Administration. What ensued was a travesty of bureaucratic correspondence worthy of the travails of Joseph K. in Kafka's trial. Would he send another copy? Would he send the original? He sent another copy. But he could not send the original since he did not have it. Could he send the name of the newspaper and the date of publication and still another copy? Yes, he said. He could tell them the name and date, and he did. And did he send another copy? He cannot remember now, because when they asked in still another letter for still another copy, he could not find it. So he wrote his friend again. Would he make more copies from the original? Yes, he said he would. And then the next day he received a call. His friend had tried to do this for him, but the original was no longer in the morgue. It had vanished. It is odd how the character of this century should be captured by a novel written at its inception. As I write in the last decade of this century, the word Kafkaesh has earned a place in the dictionary. It is defined as nightmarishly strange, mystifying, and bizarre. There is, though, to my mind, something lacking in this definition, the particular historical circumstances of the strangeness. Franz Kafka was employed by the Workers' Accident Insurance Company for the Kingdom of Bohemia from 1908 until near the end of his life in 1922. He was working there when he wrote The Trial. He must have followed the cases of wounded workers as requests and responses made on pieces of paper and various forms accumulated to make increasingly voluminous files. In 1922, Franz Kafka left the Workers' Accident Insurance Company. He was ill, and he would die just 2 years later. Was he aware that in this same year, the physicist Niels Bohr had conjectured a new model of atomic structure, one that explained the irregularities of the periodic table of the elements? One would not immediately link the imaginings of these two men together, yet history has linked them in an odd, unpredictable way, for the clarifying perceptions of nuclear history soon entered the obfuscating history of bureaucracies, courts that would not respond to petition, a privileged knowledge denied to those most affected, secret corridors and conversations bending towards absurdity with nameless judges. In this way, meaning was wedded with meaninglessness. I think there's another source of that meaninglessness too, which precedes, in a way, has shaped, has formed the very tragedy, in a way, of nuclear history, and that is the formation of masculinity itself, which in some ways constitutes a separation from the sensual realm, so that meaninglessness becomes, in a way, common or habitual. Because, indeed, what I believe is that meaning is not something that is separate from material or earthly life, but it's intrinsic to it. And when you separate spirit from matter or meaning from earthly life, then you have a problem of meaning. You have meaninglessness. And I think that much of this separation occurred as a result of the formation of empire and the values of empire, and is very linked, therefore, to an idea of masculinity which very conveniently mirrors the qualities, the virtues of a good soldier. So that in order to, for a man to be a man, he has to have quote-unquote courage under fire, and an ability to be aggressive, to dominate, to not give in to feelings of fear and vulnerability, to not break down into tears. These are all the things that are expected of a soldier in battle. But even when a man is trained his whole life in a way, or socialized, humiliated into taking on these qualities of masculinity, the social construct of masculinity, at the age of 18, he still is really not ready to be a good soldier. He has to be practically brainwashed into the roles. Oftentimes what we say is that, it's masculine nature to go and fight wars, and so in order to not have wars, we're going to have to somehow repress some kind of biological urge in men. But in fact, organized warfare can't be compared to just a fist fight between children. Young men, when they're inducted into the Army, have their heads shaved. They're given inadequate food, inadequate sleep. They're constantly humiliated. They're separated from everybody they know. They're given a number. They're not addressed by their familiar names. All of the techniques of brainwashing are what are used in boot camp and military training. So that this activity, which is supposed to be natural to men, as a matter of fact, has to be beaten into, even a man who's been socialized within a culture to be a good soldier from birth. This idea of masculinity and the whole idea of empire is less separate from the scientific model of the earth that separates matter and spirit than one would think. The military drill was invented by Frederick the Great of Prussia. And he invented it in a period in the 18th century when he was very impressed by Newton's idea of the universe. He loved Newton's concept of the universe as a mechanism that worked by itself, unaided. And he wanted to have his armies resemble such a mechanism. He was the commander of peasant armies, and peasant armies in that period, peasants in that period, who were soldiers, were famous for turning around and running home the first chance they got to tend to the fields. They weren't interested in the emperor's wars. And he had the idea that if you drilled men over and over again in the same movements, then they would become like cogs in a wheel of a great machine, and you would have an efficient army. And they would forget their own interests, they would forget themselves, and move according to command. Well, if you read the Marine Corps training manual today, it's one of the reasons that they give for drilling Marines is to habituate men to follow their commander and not their bodily impulses. So that being a good soldier is actually moving directly counter to the bodily impulses in a male body, as any body. Well, I want to read you just a brief passage from the 4th chapter of this book, which is about the Holocaust. And tell you a bit about Heinrich Himmler first. I chose to write about Heinrich Himmler in this chapter. I'm not going to go into him very much, but I chose to write about him because he is a part of nuclear history, and also because he typified so much the qualities of certain people in the nuclear bureaucracy, which is this dissociation from what is being done. He was a very efficient paper pusher. He loved to collect information in files, and that's what gave him so much power within the Third Reich, because he had secrets. He was holding secrets over everybody's head. He collected information about people. And in addition, he would order these terrible atrocities against other human beings and massacres at a distance. He didn't like to actually see anybody die or suffer. A few times that he went to Auschwitz, one of the times I believe he actually fainted, and one of the times at the Eastern Front he came close to fainting. The only time, and this I think is significant, that he could watch suffering without being very disturbed was when it was called a scientific experiment, and then somehow he could handle it, which is, I think, something that's very telling about our culture in general. Himmler was raised according to this, what Alice Miller has called poisonous pedagogy. It's the standard way of raising children in Germany during Himmler's childhood. And he was raised, I believe, according to this method. I think it's safe to say that he was raised according to the method with a vengeance, because his father was a schoolmaster. So his father, being very kind of perfectionist, really applied this method very severely. And we have a very scant record of what was going on in Himmler. He committed suicide at the end of the war when he was captured by the Allies. But there is a journal that he kept during his childhood, and one of the most telling entries in that journal, one that I think explained a lot, was he went to visit some friends, and their infant child, 2 years old, was running around without clothes on. And he wrote about this child: one should teach a child a sense of shame. And this whole method of child rearing was one of shaming, and particularly shaming towards the natural functions of the body. So he was severed from his own physical, sensual life and from his emotional life by this shaming and controlling method of child rearing at a very, very early age. And in a way, I think of think of him as a man who was, so without ground under his feet, without a connection to the material world, even the material world of his own body, that he was floating somewhere, and so that meaning and knowledge was in some way inaccessible to him. And he therefore could commit the most terrible atrocities and not be aware of what he was doing. He's also a very important part of nuclear history, because the ICBM missile that was the prototype upon which, the ICBM missile, which is the the main missile that delivers nuclear warheads was based on the prototype of the V-2 rocket. And the V-2 rocket was produced in concentration camps. Himmler was the head of the concentration camp system. And he negotiated with Hitler to have the production of missiles occur at concentration camp Dora, which was an underground mine shaft in the Harz Mountains. And it was a particularly vicious camp. People worked for 16 hours a day at such a rate with almost no sleep and very small, scant rations. They died at such a high rate that bodies piled up outside the entrance to the mine shaft quicker than trucks could come to drive the bodies away. By the way, Wernher von Braun, who was so celebrated in American history for his work on the rockets, and that work also helped with the development of the ICBM missiles, Wernher von Braun was cited by more than one survivor of concentration camp Dora as having walked into the camp to supervise the production of those missiles. In this chapter, I liken the consciousness of Himmler to a missile. The successful journey of a missile depends upon the study of ballistics. Gravitational fields vary at different heights. The relationship of a projectile to the Earth's surface will determine its trajectory. The missile may give the illusion of liberation from the Earth or even abandon. Young men dreaming of space often invest the missile with these qualities, yet paradoxically, one is more free of the consideration of gravity while traveling the surface of the Earth on foot. There is no necessity for mathematical calculation for each step, nor does one need to apply Newton's laws to take a walk. But the missile has, in a sense, been forced away from its own presence. The wisdom that is part of its own weight has been transgressed. It finds itself thus careening in a space devoid of memory, always on the verge of falling, but not falling, and hence, like one who is constantly afraid of illusion, gripped by an anxiety that cannot be resolved, even by a fate that threatens catastrophe. I'm going to end with and then I'd very much like to take questions. I'm going to end with a very different man, a different history, and also what I think of as a different possibility. Himmler was one of the things I think that happened with him is that he was a very slight man. He didn't meet the masculine standard that he was trying to apply to himself. He devised all these standards that men had to meet to join the SS, and in addition to that, they had to go through all these athletic tests to prove that they were, quote-unquote strong Aryan stock. And in fact, Himmler wasn't able to pass these tests himself. He didn't meet the physical qualifications, and he wasn't able to pass the athletic tests. Another man who was sort of slight and didn't meet this masculine ideal, and who's very famous in the 20th century, is Gandhi. And I came across him. He's part of nuclear history, as we all are. In fact, there's no one that's not part of it. But his part is, to me, very important. The man who is known as the father of the RAF, bless you, is known as the father of the RAF, and who developed the policy of bombing civilians, both during World War I and then between the wars, British Major Hugh Trenchard, did his earliest military service in India. And the year that he came to India was the year that Gandhi left India for South Africa. And the arms buildup that led to World War I was principally caused by the struggle among European nations to build colonies in Africa and Asia. They were competing among each other for holding the largest number of colonies. And so colonial history and this struggle between the British Empire and India, and by the way also South Africa, is very much a part of nuclear history. Well, Gandhi, formulated this very famous pacifism, which is also known as satyagraha, and it's not a passive approach, but a very deeply considered resistance to injustice. And where he had the illumination, the understanding that led to the formulation of satyagraha, which means standing firm by what you believe, was when he did service for the British Empire as an ambulance driver and a stretcher bearer in the British Empire's attempt to suppress the Zulu warriors in Natal. The British were particularly brutal in that suppression. I'll just read this to you. A conflict has broken out between the Zulu and the British administrators of Natal, who have annexed their land. Gandhi is dismayed with what he sees. His loyalty is strained past the breaking point. The British attempt to control what they call a rebellion through public floggings and hangings. Gandhi's corps tends mostly to the Zulu, whose festering wounds have been neglected by a European medical corps. The British have fired indiscriminately in villages, wounding men, women, and children alike, many times attacking even those Zulu friendly to the empire. This brutality precipitates a crisis in Gandhi. The old order through which he had organized his perceptions is being challenged, but it is through this crisis that he begins to see and finally commit his life in the direction of a larger principle. Looking back as I do now on that point of illumination, I begin to wonder if Gandhi's revelation was fed not only by the injustices he witnessed, but because he witnessed them as a nurse. I can make out his image now. He is bending over the body of a Zulu man whose wound has been untended for days and is now so infected that a sweetly sour odor surrounds the two. The wounded man is feverish. If he had any words of English, they have faded now in the extremity of pain. The couple has no common language except the look in the wounded man's eye, when from time to time he returns to what we call consciousness and focuses his gaze on the man who tends him. Is it that time has blurred the form, or have two men fused in some mysterious way? For they appear, one bending over the other, almost as one seamless curve, breathing together, the boundary between them erased. Does nurse join patient, or patient blend with nurse? One cannot tell. The entire atmosphere has softened. All around them, boundaries appear to be dissolving. They can hardly know that at the state somewhere to the north, the blurred edges of a projected beam of alpha particles discovered on a piece of photographic paper points to the dissolution of the boundary between matter and energy. As Ernest Rutherford notes, the atoms of matter must be the seat of intense electrical forces. Yet, though news of this has not yet been broadcast to the world, the two who are dissolving must have some sense of it. Phenomena exist long before they are observed by scientists. They can be felt. Outside the scope of vision, they continue vivid and uncompromised, except perhaps by the silent wish to be known. And so the fact that Gandhi came to Satyagraha as a nurse, I feel, is deeply significant because he was crossing a gender boundary. He was in a role that is usually reserved for women. He had entered one of the works, one of the modes of existence of private life. And he did this throughout his life. He was capable finally of imagining women's condition. He fought for women's rights as well as for the rights of Indians under the British Empire. And he himself became increasingly more androgynous. He became a more and more vulnerable person. And yet, at the same time, stronger in that vulnerability. The vision that he had, I think, is one that that would only be possible if you cross those gender lines. Because the problem of warfare, which has become so critical to our very survival in the 20th century, is inextricably bound up with the problems of gender. And both of these problems are inextricably bound up with our stance of alienation from the natural world. And yet, what is hopeful, I think, in what is a very tragic and sad picture, is that within us, as we exist, as bodies, as part of the earth, is a very profound wisdom. And also within us, I believe, is a great longing to come back to that deeper knowledge of who we really are. So I thank you. Well, I'd love to take questions if anybody has. Or just statements? Yes. Oh, that's great. Well, we had to piece it together because I did, this is sort of giving up something that happened in the book, but I did find my grandmother. She was 96 years old, and I found her in Canada. And she was, by that time, very old and had lost a lot of her memory. And so, and also, she was still keeping the secret herself. What I pieced together with a cousin is that we believe she had an affair, an extramarital affair, and was pregnant with that man's child. And then she kept the secret to protect that child. And no one else, wanted to talk about it because it was a shame on the family. Well, I went up to the island where my father was born, and I contacted my great aunt, who knew what had happened, and it was sort of a funny, sad story. She said to me, "Well, I wouldn't have told you earlier, but now I'd tell you, but I can't remember what it was." And but she did remember my grandmother's name, and that was very helpful. And then there was my name, Griffin, and so I had that. And I went to the island, which is off of New Brunswick. It's called Grand Manan. And on the boat going to the island, I happened to be talking with a woman who was from the island. I said, "Well, do you know anybody on the island named Griffin?" And she said, "Well, that guy over there is named Griffin, and go talk to him." So I went over, and he was a cousin. And because the island has very few people on it. The minute we set foot on the shore, it's just, word of mouth shot all the way around the island. Everybody knew we were there. And he took us to his father, who later said to me that when I walked in the door, it looked like his mother had walked in the kitchen. And the whole family congregated into the kitchen, and we traded stories about what had happened to everyone. And then I went to visit my grandmother the next day. I said, "Well, do you know anything about Ina Benson?" And there was this big pause. And she said, "Oh, well, she's up in the nursing home." So I went up and spent the day with her. It was quite moving. And it was much more profound experience than I even knew it was, even though I went to all that trouble and knew it was important to me, and drove for this long period, and a period when I was absolutely exhausted, and drove a whole day and night to get up there, and brought my daughter up, and yet all that time I didn't really understand how important it was to me. I think I began to realize how important it was to me when the rented car that I had died, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get up to the nursing home, and I started kicking the car. I was just in such a rage, and then I broke down into tears, and then I knew how important this was, and it made me understand in the course of the book how severe these splittings are that have occurred throughout in every possible way in our culture. The separations from things in ourselves, separations in our families, one tribe from another, or one tribe splitting, and the diasporas, and we carry around these pains within us, and we don't even know that we're feeling it. until there's a coming together again. I heard a very moving story, which is in the book, of a man who survived Hiroshima, and he found his sister, who he'd been separated with when she was, really almost, 2 or 3, and they found each other again, and the grief there was the joy and the grief could come out at that moment too. Neither of them had been able to experience the grief until they were back together. So there's a grief within us, I think, that in some cases causes more suffering because we're not aware of it. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I would be very pessimistic if there were not that grief. The grief the grief tells us that it wasn't meant to be. We're not supposed to be separated like this. We're not supposed to make enemies. We're not supposed to have these great chasms. We're not supposed to have this alienation from nature. We're not supposed to split the atom. We're not supposed to split ourselves and our consciousness up into, private and public and masculine and feminine. Is that grief, to me, is what is there as proof of a harmony and a wholeness and a connectedness. Mm-hmm. Yes. I can't say that it isn't a natural development of societies. What I'm saying, and I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist. There are many people who quarrel with those anthropologists who quarreled with Mead, so it's not a settled question. Erich Fromm was also someone who argued that there was not violence across the boards in every society. There certainly is not all the same forms of violence that we know, and organized war does not exist in every culture. There may be violence, but organized war is something altogether different. And I think that there's a way in which organized war is naturalized when we confuse it with, say, an eruption of violence where somebody hits somebody. That's something, again, entirely. Most soldiers really don't have the vaguest notion of what they're fighting for. They have no personal stake in it. They're fired up around some abstract notion of flag or patriotism. A lot of, I've interviewed young men who were young, and joined Hitler's armies in this sort of idealistic blaze. They had no idea what they were getting into. They didn't understand anything about politics, and they didn't know what warfare was about. And I think that's true of many of the young men who got engaged in the Vietnam War here. Ron Kovacs, whom I've talked with at length about this, and has a very similar vision that I do about men in the military, has told a story that testifies to that. And so, in fact, even if a certain kind of aggression is natural to human beings, and I think that's entirely possible, it doesn't mean that organized warfare is natural. I think, in fact, as I said earlier, that you almost have to be battered into it. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yes, and his relationship with his wife, you mean? Yeah, he wasn't perfect, and I think that that those dichotomies are going to exist in most people until the whole fabric is changed. I think he did an enormous amount in his life. He accomplished a great deal, but it doesn't mean that everything he did was perfect. Many Indian feminists who I spoke to feel the same way about Gandhi, very grateful to him for much of what he was able to do, and yet still he's, he can't be taken as a model for absolutely every aspect of his life. And I think the whole need we have in the culture to place certain people above, and because they're able in one area or do something good, to take everything they do and make it exemplary, is part of this system in a way. It's a system of ideals rather than embracing what is real and understanding that that life is complex and there are always ambiguities and textures and difficulties, and it doesn't conform to these very perfect little grids, that we try to make of things. Yes. Well, in the first place, no, I don't believe in the noble savage because I don't believe anybody's savage. Those earlier traditional cultures are cultures, and they have technologies. And but I do believe that some of those traditional cultures are more sophisticated in certain ways than we are. And I certainly agree with you that they too are not to be idealized, and they have problems also, some very grave. But there is a way in particularly Western civilization that has become so quote unquote globalized that we think of ourselves as superior because we can do all these marvelous technological feats. We don't think of other kinds of development. For instance, an emotional development that allows you to live with death, allows you to live with change and with nature. We're very, very undeveloped in that way. And some older cultures, for instance, the Tibetan culture, have very, very sophisticated ways to teach people how to accept aging and change and loss and death with a great deal of grace. The Dalai Lama is an example of that. And I'm not a worshiper of the Dalai Lama, but I admire the ability of someone to speak the way he does about the Chinese. And I'm astonished by it as a Westerner. I don't have that ability that he has and that many Tibetans have. So what I'm saying here is that I would certainly agree with you that one shouldn't elevate or create a kind of a romantic, sentimental image of other cultures. It's really important for us to come down off our pedestal belonging to Western civilization. And then, in addition, we don't need to have any idea of a noble savage to be worried about what we've done in this technology with our weaponry. It's not only, by the way, the deployment of nuclear weapons that is a danger to us, but it's radiation itself. It's the production of nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear power. And this is something which we're going to have to begin to take very seriously indeed within these next 2 decades. We've managed to avert the Cold War, and let's hope that we continue on that path and not step back into a different form of Cold War. But we haven't stopped the production of nuclear power, and we haven't found any solution for all the radiation waste. In fact, there's no good solution for radiation waste except to stop producing it, and then we could take the entire military budget and apply it simply to trying to prevent that radiation waste from entering the biosphere in such a way as to cause disease not only for us, but for our children, our grandchildren, the children of our grandchildren, the children of the children of our grandchildren, unto more generations than I could count if I were steadily to do so in this auditorium for the next 3 days. Yes. This way in which we separate ourselves from other living beings is coming home to us now. For instance, I have an illness called chronic fatigue immune dysfunction, and it's an illness of the immune system. And I realized that I had the illness near the end of writing this book. While I was writing the book, I interviewed many people who have radiation sickness. And as I became aware of my own illness, I was aware that the disease I have, the symptoms, are absolutely identical to those of radiation sickness. I think there's a good reason to ask the scientific community to begin pouring money into testing what radiation has done to the human immune system. While I was in Germany in 1988, I suffered a collapse from the illness I have, and at the time I was reading in the newspapers of the deaths of a great many of seals who were dying in the North Sea, and they were washed ashore, and it was discovered that something was wrong with their immune systems. Now, a few years later, we read of the enormous amount of radiation dumping that the Soviet Union did in the North Sea. Is there a connection? It's something that is not being followed up. It's not being researched, and that's, I think, a very, very serious denial. It's a denial that cuts across in many directions. And one of the directions is the denial of the effects of the effect of the earth on human beings, but it's also a denial. We look at the seals dying there on the beach, and yet not see that this can happen to us. When I was in Germany, I had a dream that I was on a beach, and there was people there with sun lotion on themselves and dark glasses and sunning in the sun, and something that I love to do myself. And there was this stack of seals, and I'd seen a newspaper photograph of stacks of seals dead. And I stood in front of this stack of seals and said, "Don't you see? This is going to be you if we don't do something about it." But we can read about the extinction of other species, and yet we don't see that as having anything to do with ourselves, because we have this false idea of separation from animals and plants. Well, thank you.
I want to thank Susan Griffin for being with us this evening. Thank you all for coming. Please join us outside for a book selling and signing.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.